The disciples seemed to know that Jesus would die and then come again before he told them. In Matthew 24:3, the disciples asked Jesus what would be the sign of his coming. Because we're so familiar with this passage, most of us just pass over it. But if we think about it, Jesus hadn't even died or ascended, and he hadn't had the Last Supper where he explained things to them plainly. How did the disciples even know to ask this question? How did they know he would be coming again? This is Nelson with the Gospel in the End Times. The mission of our top 30 rated YouTube channel is to unlock the mysterious prophecies by showing how Scripture interprets Scripture, and then to help you be a doer of the Word, not just a hearer, by showing you how to apply these prophecies. Now, if we're going to figure this out, this mystery about how the disciples knew Jesus would be coming again, we need to understand what the Old Testament says about the Messiah, because frankly, we can be pretty sure the disciples weren't even fully aware that a cross lay ahead for Jesus, let alone that he would come again. All they had was their understanding of the Old Testament, Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms. In this video, we're going to look at a couple points. First, we'll examine what happened on the day the disciples asked the question. Second, we'll look at what Old Testament passage in particular the disciples were asking about when they questioned Jesus, and yes, we can know this almost for certain. And then third, at the end of the video, we'll show how Jesus' answer to the disciples unpacks this Old Testament passage. So now we know where we're going. Let's get started. The disciples asked this strange question during what we call Holy Week, the week after Jesus rode into Jerusalem on a donkey on Palm Sunday and taught in the temple area on the remaining days. In the evening, he and the disciples would return to the Mount of Olives and sleep there. This question was asked on the very last day Jesus would teach in the temple. After having been tested by the Pharisees and Sadducees previously, these Jewish leaders finally realized they would be unable to trick Jesus. He was simply too wise for them. Then it was Jesus' turn to call woes out on them. In Matthew 23, Jesus let the Pharisees have it. In a series of rebukes, Jesus called them out. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, calling them a brood of vipers, whitewashed tombs, and blind guides. I'm certain up to that point the disciples were hoping that the Pharisees would finally see Jesus for what he was, the Messiah of Israel, and that the Pharisees would accept him as king. Then the disciples would be seated on his right and left, and all would be good in their eyes. But that wasn't going to be the case. There was no going back from this tirade on Jesus' part. Jesus left them with this rebuke. Behold, your house is being left to you desolate. For I say to you, from now on, you will not see me until you say, Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Matthew 23:38 through 39. Then Jesus and his disciples left the temple. The disciples realized there was no going back, no turning around from this outburst. It was a point of no return, and I'm relatively certain they knew, and the Pharisees knew, Jesus was quoting from the Old Testament. When he said, your house is left to you desolate, For if you men will indeed perform this thing, then kings will enter the gates of this house, sitting in David's place on his throne, riding in chariots and on horses, even the king himself and his servants and his people. But if you will not obey these words, I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that this house will become a desolation. Jesus was saying that if the leaders of Israel had been righteous, the Messianic era would have begun and the rightful king, the Messiah, would sit upon Israel's throne. But as it was, their house, the house of David and the temple itself, was being left desolate. There would be no deliverer king setting them free from Rome at that point. As Jesus led them out of the temple, the disciples looked around at the beautiful temple stones, which we know from Luke 21 were adorned with precious gems and votive gifts of burning candles. One of the disciples pointed out these things to him and said, "Teacher, behold, what wonderful stones and wonderful buildings." To which Jesus replied, "Do you see these great buildings? Not one will be left upon another which will not be torn down." Not only was the throne of David and the kingdom not going to be restored, but the temple itself was going to be destroyed. I'm pretty sure the rest of the walk up to the camp on the Mount of Olives was pretty quiet for the disciples as they contemplated these things. Everything they dreamed of for themselves was destroyed and shattered by Jesus' words. No kingdom and no temple. No important government roles for them to fill. When they reached the Mount of Olives, 4 of Jesus' disciples asked him some questions privately, away from the other disciples. These questions show that they understood the Old Testament prophecies Jesus had just referred to, and they wanted him to explain the prophecies to them. They asked, "Tell us, when will these things happen? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" Matthew 24:3. We can know with precision what Old Testament passage the disciples were asking about because all 3 questions the disciples were asking are direct references to this one passage. The disciples asked when the temple would be destroyed, what would be the sign of Jesus' coming or return, and the end of the age. These concepts all come from this one passage, Daniel 9:26 through 27, possibly the most famous prophecy in the whole Bible. Let's look at the first half of the passage. Then, after the 62 weeks, the Messiah will be cut off or killed and have nothing. And the people of the prince who is to come will destroy the city and the sanctuary, and its end will come with a flood. Even to the end there will be war. Desolations are determined. Jesus said he was going to die shortly, and sure enough, this passage talks about the Messiah being cut off. Jesus said the temple was going to be destroyed, and Daniel 9:26 tells us the city and temple would be destroyed. Jesus told the Pharisees that their house would be left desolate, and Daniel 9:26 speaks of desolations that are decreed. In the Septuagint, Greek Old Testament of the next verse, Daniel 9:27, the phrase parallel to end of the age appears. At the consummation of the age, an end shall be put to the desolation. In the Greek, the word for end is syntelia, meaning consummation. It is rarely used in the Bible, but found in this verse in Daniel, and the same word is found in Matthew 24:3. The 2 ideas are identical. In fact, it is a direct quote. This is what the disciples were asking about when they mentioned the end or consummation of the age. So we have 4 exact parallels in this one Old Testament passage. But what about the question of Jesus' coming or return? Where in the world did that come from? Why? From Daniel 9:26 as well. Let's look at it again, but closer now. To modern readers, they see nothing in this passage about Jesus' return. To them, it's about the death of the Messiah on the cross and the destruction of the temple by the people of the Antichrist, who they think is the prince who is to come. But that, in my opinion, is a misinterpretation and not the way the disciples saw the passage. They realized that the Messiah and the prince were the same person. Just one verse previously, they saw this person referred to as Messiah the Prince. You are to know and discern that from the issuing of a decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince, there will be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. So when they saw these same titles, Messiah and Prince, in the very next verse, they, and probably most Jews at that time, realized Messiah and Prince were the same person. So in our opinion, the prince who is to come isn't the Antichrist. It's Jesus, the Son of the Father. He is the Prince of the King. That is where the disciples got the idea about his coming or return. Jesus is the prince who is to come, and his people would destroy the temple. That's how they linked his coming with the destruction of the temple. They didn't get it all right, but they sure nailed that aspect. Now, if you don't regularly follow this ministry, it may seem like a foreign and strange concept to you. If you want to learn more about why this is so, to learn all the other biblical proofs that the prince who is to come is Jesus and not the Antichrist, click on the banner for this video from our Daniel series to learn all about it. But if you already realize this, or just want to continue, let's go. So the disciples' 3 questions. When will these things take place? That is, the destruction of the temple. What is the sign of your coming? And what is the sign of the consummation of the age? They all came from Daniel 9. Therefore, Jesus' answer should have come from Daniel as well. And it did. That answer is known as the Olivet Discourse. And there are multiple references to the book of Daniel in Jesus' answer. The most famous is Matthew 24:15 through 16, which discusses the abomination of desolation. Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, which is spoken of through Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand, then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. Notice Jesus said, when you see the abomination. This is the first sign the disciples were asking for. The sign of the end or consummation of the age that it is about to unfold. It is a sign Jesus expects the last generation to see. And this is also a direct reference to the Septuagint text we've already looked at. And 1 week shall establish the covenant with the many, and in the midst of the week my sacrifice and drink offering shall be taken away, and on the temple the abomination of desolations. So this is a direct answer to one of the disciples' questions. Jesus pointed them back to Daniel 9 for the sign that they were looking for. In Luke 21's version of the Olivet Discourse, Jesus says, "These are the days of vengeance, so that all things which are written will be fulfilled." This also is a direct reference to Daniel 9 as well, in which the prophet is given 6 things that will happen at the end of the prophecy. 70 weeks have been decreed for your people in your holy city, to finish the transgression, to make an end of sin, to make atonement for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy. Sealing up prophecy is the same as all things which are written being fulfilled. and this is something that absolutely did not happen in 70 AD. And of course, the climax of all three versions of the Olivet Discourse in Matthew, Mark, and Luke all contain a reference to Jesus coming on the clouds. This is also a reference to Daniel. Behold, with the clouds of heaven, one like a son of man was coming. Daniel 7:13. So to tie this part of the video together, Jesus' mention of the destruction of the temple and the desolation of the house of David sparked a memory of Daniel 9 in his disciples. They then asked their famous 3 end-time questions, including one about Jesus' coming. This in turn led to Jesus giving an explanation of the prophecies in the book of Daniel, which we now call the Olivet Discourse. But the key to this video is that the only logical way the disciples could have spoken about Jesus coming or returning was based on the phrase, "the Prince who is to come," a phrase that is greatly misunderstood today, but obviously was one the disciples identified with Jesus. Our next video will focus on another aspect of the life of Jesus and how it foreshadowed the end times. We'll be looking at Jesus' temptations and how they will become our end-time temptations. Until then, this is Nelson with the Gospel in the End Times. Our videos help you understand difficult prophecies by showing how Scripture interprets Scripture, and they help you be a doer of the Word, not just a hearer, by showing how to apply these prophecies.